that you're gonna look great. But if you wanna stay in shape, well, you better hit the GymWits.
That's right, man. Tell 'em.
Welcome to the GymWits podcast. I'm Ryan George.
I'm Justin Guild, a.k.a. Chef Sonic.
And we are the GymWits.
So what do you think about this? I know when we were growing up, it would almost be unheard of. But do you know the deal with all the NBA fans being upset that LeBron and some other sort of star players have been sitting out?
Honestly, I read something. I saw a headline, but I don't really. So they've been sitting out in advance of the playoffs?
Yeah, they're coasting to the playoffs. The coach is sitting them because there's a lot of evidence that extra wear and tear, you're not going to be as strong and powerful for the playoffs. You also risk injury. So it seems to make sense. If it's about winning, that seems like a sensible move.
Yeah.
But the fans are like, wait a minute, this is not what we pay for.
Yeah.
We pay to see, the star players. So the league's sort of getting involved. They're pissed off. A lot of the commentators are like saying, well, we understand that this is why you rest players, but this is a farce. Like, they're paid millions of dollars to play. But what it's like, really, if it's about winning, if you could do anything you can to win, it's not against the rules to sit your players.
It's not against the rules. I understand both perspectives. I think especially if you're a fan of the team and you're looking towards the playoffs, it makes sense.
Then the fans might do it. But if you're another team playing them, and the Cavaliers are in town, you want to see LeBron play.
You're paying. Yeah, you bought your tickets way in advance.
Or they're watching the game.
And also, they probably a lot of times
too.
they probably charge. I don't know if they do, if they're allowed to, but they probably, if they are, they would charge higher rates to or the tickets for.
They're just natural. They're the same price, but they're
they
naturally. Well, it's not fair. It's not. You can't charge more for a certain
I don't know.
game.
Maybe okay.
Like for season tickets are the same for game,
Yeah.
but on StubHub the prices are going to go up when it's a good team that's playing.
So I think these guys make a lot of money. There is a lot of money involved. So I tend to side with the people that think it's something messed up about that. Because, it's one thing if you're sitting your guys like a couple games before the seasons, like the playoffs. I can understand that, but to do it regularly like this far out. It's not right. People do. There is a ton of money at stake.
Entertainment.
At the end of the day, it is entertainment. Yes, you want to win. You want to avoid injury, but there are ways to do that. Maybe play them. Play fewer minutes. Yeah. But to just outright sit people, I think is not. It doesn't sit well with me. Just again.
But if it's in the rules, there's no rules that say that you can't. What rights does anyone have to say?
No one has rights, but as a fan,
complain and not buy the tickets.
And exactly. So I mean, that's the next step. And I think.
But do you consider it a bait and switch?
What
is it like? Sort of a bait and switch. These teams are going to play, but you don't get the players on the teams.
Yeah, and it's like to me, it's just not sportsmanlike. Yeah, I get it. I get that that you want to rest the players and you want to keep them healthy. But you also want to show your best, especially for the fans. And at the end of the day, that's why they're making so much money, because people are willing to spend ridiculous amounts of money to watch people play a game. And so I do have a problem. And that's part of why I've kind of disconnected myself from most sports to begin with, is because money has disconnected them from the fans in a lot of ways, whether it's the management or the players. And I just can't, it's hard for me to get behind,
something like that.
Look at these guys, they make so much, and then, in some situations.
But remember, it might not even be the player's decision. It might be the coach's.
It might be the coach's decision. Yeah.
But no, so then sort of changing it a little bit, what if in a fight, one guy is clearly up 4 rounds to, on a championship fight, 4 rounds to 0, and for the final round he just decides to either pull guard and just stay in guard the whole time, or just never throw strikes, just take a defensive posture the whole time because he knows he's coasting, just to make for a very anticlimactic 5th round, just to make sure he doesn't get knocked out and he's really tight.
Not really a good analogy though, because that's kind of like if you're playing a game and it's fairly close and you just start holding on to the ball, like letting the shot clock run out with 5 minutes left.
Every team
I think
does
that's
that.
Part of the actual game.
And sitting out is as far as a
whole sitting
season?
out, but that's more about resting yourself for. But it's hard to compare a combat sport, which it's one day, one event, versus a basketball season, which which happens over the course of months.
Yeah.
So I think it's tough to make that draw that analogy, because within one, yes,
you don't want to
see someone,
that in a
but
fight?
in a fight, yes, because you're trying to win that fight, and then but here's the important thing: it's incumbent upon the other fighter to find a way around that. If you're the one losing, you got to figure it out.
But you know how hard it is.
I know how hard it is.
A good defensive guy doesn't want to engage. It's almost impossible.
But I know how hard it is. But then you've got to figure something out.
I mean, he's going to lose the round.
You
but
might,
he's okay.
yeah.
I mean,
well, then you got to go for broke. I mean, you lost the first 4 rounds, so you've got to do something to change it. So I understand. No, I totally get that. Like you want someone to just put their head down and risk it all for the excitement of the fans. But that's different to me from someone just outright just sitting out.
Yeah.
It'd kind of be I don't know. It's more analogous if like you've got if you got a guy who's fighting the top contender, and a few weeks before the fight he has I have air quotes, an injury, and then the guy who was supposed to fight then has to fight a top contender, loses, and then he gets to fight somebody who's not as good, in some way ducking the real important fight.
All right.
Again, that's a bad analogy too, but still I think in a fight it's a little bit different. You have two parties and you're involved. But if somebody just outright sits out, I understand. I understand both sides.
At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the fans control it. If the fans start complaining, they stop buying it, things will change.
Yeah, it's same thing with the political system. No matter what side you're on, if you're not happy, then you need your voice needs to be heard. And if enough people allow their voice to be heard, things will have to change. But if you kind of get complacent or you sit back and you just allow it's kind of same old, and then nothing changes. So it's same. Like I said, same thing with sports. If you're frustrated with the amount of money or that the players are disconnected from the fans, whatever, then stop following the sport. But if you're going to obsessively follow the sport, regardless of how they treat their fans, then that's going to keep happening.
Yep. All right. So,
I guess
speaking of intensity and
before we get to that, we have a little study. Actually, more like dissertation of the week. So I guess basically it was interesting. Do you know what exergaming is? And I don't know if this is coined by this guy Tauman Kari.
Is it a kind of like a video game that has you exercising?
Yeah, pretty much. Okay. Well, think of like Pokemon Go or like Zombie
or
Run
Dance Revolution. Or
exactly. So basically, you have these games that allow where you have to be active. So where typical gaming, as we grew up with, it makes you more sedentary because you're basically sitting down watching a screen. So you're not moving anything but your thumbs.
You're moving your thumbs.
You're moving your thumbs. Okay. Or with the old NES gamepad, maybe that was the one time. But even that, you ended up just using. It was like you hit it like a drum set. Did you have that like the jogging one where you don't run on it, you just start smashing it like you're hitting a drum set. So
what about the Power Glove?
Yeah.
That was a good piece of equipment, right?
The good old days. So anyway, I'll give you a quote. He said, "So one central advantage of exergames is their ability to combine enjoyment and utility. And for many, that's the underlying reason for playing. This way, the games can offer physical activity to their players on the side of gaming without the players necessarily even realizing this. Thus, these games can act as a means to make exercise more fun, especially for those who are otherwise less interested about exercising." So you can read the full thing. It's an interesting paper. And basically, the idea is that the benefits of these games, so basically, you really can't tell the kids. It's funny because we talked about this earlier with nihilism, but we won't get into the whole thing. But basically, you can't tell the kids like, "Hey, play this game. You'll get in shape," right? Because that's not gonna motivate them. But the fun and the social aspects of the game that will allow them to engage and interact and play and participate with the side benefit of getting their daily activity requirement. So a game like Pokemon Go, kids that are playing it, I don't know if they're still playing it, but they'll meet their daily activity requirement and they're having fun and it has social benefits. So it increases their social well-being. They're hanging out, they're making friends. So there are benefits to, quote, exergaming and the fitness benefits, but those fitness benefits are kind of like a side, like kind of a result of the social and fun and all the other stuff that comes with it. And so again, interesting article. I will post in the show notes. A bunch of articles posted in the show notes because a good deal of things that had to be.
So now, is this just? Do they think it's just good for kids, or really anyone could?
Well, good for anyone, but it seems to be that younger. It definitely skews younger. But the interesting thing too, though, is with the kind of extra gaming, is that it runs across genders. So basically, male and female play it at equal rates, but it is definitely skews younger. So
sure,
but I think with the advent of VR and augmented reality, that might change a bit. I guess we'll see. We're gonna see in the future how this applies to adults. Like, is there a way to take that and bring it to adults? What's interesting, and now we're going a little off there, I've seen exercise-based games in gyms. Like a couple gyms I've been at have had different types of systems where you can, like a bike will have, like there's one that their bikes next to each other, and there's a game component because there's a screen on it, and you can race other people, or you can play games, or you can do different things that try to make exercise a game. But those aren't popular, at least from what my experience at the gyms. I don't know, I don't have any studies to back that up, but just my own anecdotal experience for years of seeing different games, they're not utilized all that much. And so I think it's interesting because it's the opposite, where you're taking an exercise, right, like a bike, and turning it into a game, versus you're taking a game, Pokemon, and adding exercise to it. So it seems that the motivation has to be the gaming, and then the exercise is like this residual, benefit, where if you take a regular piece of exercise and say, hey, it's going to be fun, it's a game, that doesn't seem to motivate people as much.
Why would it? It just, it's like, it's obvious what it is.
Yeah.
It seems like a sort of a lame way of trying to disguise something as a game.
I guess so.
But it's true, yeah, when it's a game and you're just playing it, you're not thinking that it's exercise.
Yeah.
You're just playing the game.
Yeah, exactly. So,
that's important. Makes sense.
So today's discussion is going to be on RPEs, or rate of perceived exertion. Mm-hmm. So my question for you is, and it's funny, I don't think I've ever had this discussion with you or talked about it. When you're working out, how do you determine the intensity, or how do you tell yourself, where you're at, or, just what's your mindset when you're working out?
Well, I generally just go by what my body says. Mm-hmm. I also go by what that chart on that used to be at Life Fitness, where it's like 1, no effort, 2,
okay, good,
lightly sweating, 3. I don't really go with that. I just listen to my body. If my heart is really pounding and I'm like really sweating and I'm like really exhausted, I know I've perceived. If I'm lifting, if I sort of go to exhaustion or close to it, I know I've put out a lot. If I'm running or do a sprint or interval of sorts, and I'm just like, I'm really breathing heavy, and I feel it. I just know my body. I know what exertion is, and I know what I have to do in order to exert. I've been doing it for a while, so I know what exertion really does. So I know that there's a heart monitor, which I've never used. I know that people do that, but that's, I know that's another way to do it, but is there anything besides that?
Yeah, well, okay, yeah, I guess that's what today's episode will be about. So basically, when it comes to measuring your output, it's kind of challenging, especially for the average person. Obviously, if you're in a kind of more clinical setting, there are various kinds of invasive methods of measuring your output, or how much lactates in the blood, or there are machines that can measure your oxygen uptake. And then you mentioned, so I mean, the most practical things would be there are two options, or or 3 if you want to include like just not thinking about it. But one would be a heart rate monitor.
Okay.
The second would be RPEs, or rate of perceived exertion. So obviously, heart rate monitor is pretty straightforward. It measures your heart rate, so that can give you an idea, especially when you're doing cardio or aerobic activity. It'll let you know relatively how hard you're working. There's some other ways to measure. It's not 100%, but what?
Wait. So how do you actually measure the RPE?
Okay, so that's the whole thing. So basically, what is?
I know you have beats per minute with your heart.
Yeah. So basically, RPEs is it's perception, right? It's the rate of perceived exertion. So what that means is how hard you think you're working.
Out. Okay.
So basically, it was kind of there have been studies on it dating back to the 60s, and it's pretty accurate. So basically, there are a number of there are a number of different methods, a couple of different major methods of determining it. But it's kind of pioneered by this guy, Gunnar Borg, and he has a scale kind of named after him. And basically, it assigns a number to an intensity level. So
like that thing on like the poster on the wall.
Yeah, exactly. Just like the poster on the wall. So basically,
but that poster is just real common sense.
Well, no. So I thought so, but not really. So two things. Now, it should be common sense, but people don't really often, at least from what I find, they don't take it into account. So but when you start, there's a way to make your workouts because also remember we talk about specificity. So I do the same thing where I don't really think, I just work. And so sometimes you need to think, okay, what, based on what your program is and how long you want to work out, you do need to account for how hard you feel like you're working. And often people just aren't working hard enough.
Well,
And so by adding that scale, it kind of helps, you
just to be even aware of it.
Yeah.
Might help. Yeah.
Exactly. So now let's say just off the basic, I'll give you the base idea, which is like you have a 1 to 10 scale, 1 being easy, 10 being extremely hard. And we'll get a little bit more specific on it. Can you see any problems with that? If I'm telling you, okay, you're going to run and 1 is, 1 is easy, 10 is you're dying, and I want you to run it like a 7. What's hard with that? What's difficult about that? Are there any challenges?
Well, people have way, way different thresholds for what they think is hard.
So okay. So do you mean the threshold or their kind of subjective?
Their view on what's hard. Well, they're either their pain threshold, their the shape that they're in.
Yeah.
Right. But also what they perceive as very difficult.
Yeah.
Right. If running or doing some weights, like if doing a little bit and you're like, oh, this was so hard. Some people just don't know what it means to work out really hard. So if they work out sort of moderately hard, they might think it's they're really exerting.
Yeah.
But especially if you're not in great shape to begin with, but I guess it's relative to the shape that you're in. But still, I think that some people really don't know how to push themselves. Mm-hmm. So they might think that they're working out hard, right? They might think they're doing something, and they don't know that they're really not doing all that much.
Yeah. So the main problem with anything like this is it kind of quantifies the subjective experience. Mm-hmm. So it's and it makes it, or it's trying to quantify a subjective experience. So how do you do that when people experience pain differently and people so basically the scale, the way it accounts for it is by setting up this scale. So the initial one, we've seen a 1 to 10 and there's a 6 to 20. So the Borg's kind of initial scale was basically a 6 to 20. So basically the reason why it's like 6 to 20, why 6 to 20? Is it that there are more numbers? It makes it more complicated. The reason why is basically it by a factor of 10 connects to your heart rate. So normal heart rate's going to be 60 beats. A healthy person's around 60 beats per minute. Not everyone's there, trust me. But normal resting heart rate 60 beats per minute, and then normal max heart rate's about 200 beats per minute. Okay. So, right, so it's a nice clean thing, right? You multiply by that by 10, and you, for the most part, you have a range of heart rate, 60 being at rest and 200 being normal. So basically, the way that and then studies over the years have borne this out. So for the most part, wherever people feel like they are on the scale is about where their heart rate is, give or take a little bit. You can count for certain things. For example, somebody in their 60s is going to have a different max heart rate than somebody in their 20s. So if you account for that, for the most part, let's say if you're at a 7 on this list, that would be considered very, very light. If you're at a 9 on that on that range, you'd be very light. If you're at 11, that's fairly light. If you're at 13, it's somewhat hard. If you're at 15, it's hard. If you're at 17, it's very hard. If you're at 19, it's very, very hard. You're at 20, you're at your max. So those ranges tend to correlate with heart rate. So if you're at 200 beats per minute, you're max. If you're at 19 beats per minute,
sure.
So that range seems to work out well, and it kind of increases incrementally by each one. And so that scale allows you to kind of give so if you're working out, and I tell you, I want you to be at a 15 out of 20, with 15 being, pretty hard, that gives you a little bit of an idea of where to be at, right?
So if it's all based on heart rate, then why even bother having it? Just know that your heart rate is a certain thing, and that's what it is. It's just like saying, your heart rate's fast, so just know that your heart rate's fast.
Okay, so no, you're right. There's more than just heart rate. So heart rate tends to be the most closely related to to your rate of perceived exertion. But there are other variables. There's blood lactate levels are going to be related to an extent, not quite as close. There are other physical.
So I need a blood lactate monitor.
And there, yeah, and there are other physical and psychological roles. So actually, there's a couple things I was going to talk about this later, but I'll bring these up now to show you how your perceived exertion can be affected. So mental fatigue can have an effect on your RPE. So, and there was a study, a couple studies performed, but one which is interesting. They basically had the subjects perform a mentally strenuous task prior to exercise, and then after exertion, their RPE was diminished by like 15%. So it diminished you felt like less work made you feel like you were more fatigued, right? And then there was another study on the opposite end of the spectrum that showed that listening to your favorite kind of music improved your RPE. So you were actually able to work harder than you perceived when listening to music that you really enjoyed. So those are a couple things I was going to talk about later, but that goes to show you that while heart rate is a big part of it, it's not completely connected. So as we talked about, there's the 6 to 20 scale. So I wanted to talk about one other scale, and I'll explain kind of how you can practically use these if it doesn't make sense already. But there's another scale that Borg created, which was a 1 to 10. So it's funny because I always thought that the 1 to 10 was like the initial one, and that was just easier. And then the 6 to 20 came out because it was more complicated and had more steps, but that really wasn't the case. So basically the 1 to 10 scale uses what's called a category ratio scale. It uses magnitude estimation. It's all stuff So basically, the idea is that different. So you're given an intensity, let's say a baseline, and then you assign a number to that, and then you have to find intensities that are proportional to that initial stimulus. So let's say, for example, I give you you do a biceps curl, just a regular curl, and you assign a number to that. Let's say a 2.
Interesting.
If you double that, then you get 4. If you half that, you get 1. So where in this world or in this type of measuring system, right, you'd have like a 0 would be nothing, right? And 0.5 would be very, very weak. So 1, right, which is double 0.5 would be very weak. And then 2, which is double 1 would be weak. And 3 would be moderate and et cetera, and so on. So that each one is kind of proportional to the half. So if you're at 10, which is very, very strong, half of that would be 5, which would be strong. So that was another way. Again, they're kind of I don't quite understand all the science behind how they determine how it works, but either scale works well. So when you're exercising, whether you're doing a 6 to 20 or 1 to 10, it's good to kind of keep in mind where you should be, because depending on the type of exercise, you want to keep that in mind. So the example I'd give would be if you're running and you're doing a 50-minute run. If you're running at 10 or even 9, which is near your max, it's going to be near impossible to keep that up for the entire time.
Yeah.
So you're probably going to need to be closer to a 7 or 6, which would be, let's say, strong, moderate, strong, or very strong. Like that, if you're a high-level runner. If you're not, you may need to be closer to the 3, a moderate, or 4, somewhat strong.
Now, about this, what about when you put time into the equation? So if you run at a 6 or a 7 for a longer time, doesn't it become like an 8 or a 9? It has to, because you're getting more fatigue. The more run,
that's a good question.
You're not just a robot. You can't just run. You get more tired, more fatigued. Your heart beats faster. You need more oxygen as you go.
It will get more difficult. But if you're doing let's say an hour run, or whatever, 45-minute run, you're going to try to maintain your heart rate at a certain level. So let's say you might try to maintain it at a level that's proportional to a 6 or a 7 for that entire hour.
Your speed would have to go down.
No, well, yes, but in order to maintain that for the hour versus
maintain your heart rate. But people don't do that. People generally run. Well, maybe I don't know. People do run.
No, typically,
I've always thought people run faster as they go along.
No. If you're a runner, no.
People run slower as you go.
For either,
I thought people try to maintain a steady tempo.
Yeah, you maintain a steady pace. So either your heart rate starts to go up because you start to fatigue, so you start to physically fatigue and you can't keep up the pace you started with. But most people, at least as far as I know, aren't going to increase the pace unless it's a race or there's another reason to increase it. Typically, you're trying to keep yourself at a certain heart rate to manage for the entire run. So the longer the run, the lower you'd be able to maintain your heart rate, because you can't maintain, if you're at a 9, you can't maintain a 9 for 50 minutes to an hour.
What about muscle fatigue? Like if you do a lot of running, you're not.
Yeah, I mean that comes down.
When your legs start to get tired.
Yeah, well, that comes down to muscle endurance, and so that's still
muscle endurance not.
That still plays a role in it, but then that's a different. Then then you have to fight that. So then it might be, look, nobody's going to start. No matter what your shape is, no one's going to start by running, an hour, no matter what the fitness level. So you'd build to that anyway. But in general, when you are working out, let's say, for example, you're fairly new and you want to run for 45 minutes, then if you say I need to be in a 6, as you're running, if you start creeping up into 7 or 8, then you got to slow down. That's it. So whatever you do, whatever the activity is, you're trying to hover in that 6 range. And as you feel like, for you. Yeah. So as you feel like you're drifting out of that 6 into a 7 or 8, then you pull yourself back down, you slow. Okay. Or if you feel like you're dropping down to a 3 or 4, then you increase the pace. So part of it is kind of like you have a track and there's a ball in that track, and you've got to keep that ball in that track the whole time. And if it dips below, you got to increase to pull it back up. If it goes too high, you slow down to bring it back down. So part of the heart rate, part of the training though, is to manage that, because I know tons of people. This happens a lot with my classes where. Again, my classes are more conditioning based. There's more intervals involved, but it's same idea applies. They push themselves so hard in the beginning, where they're pushing themselves to close to a 9 or a 10, that they can't keep up halfway into it. So you have to keep that in mind when you're working out, is that you need to find the place that you're going to stay in and stay in that range rather than going too far out. Or if you're at a 1 or a 2 or 3, and you're there too long, then you'll never get the workout you want. So that that also applies to pushing the pace. So I'll post like what each number correlates to, but in general, if you're not used to training like this, it's good to kind of stay, in the range that's dictated by whatever the workout is.
So now we were talking a lot about running and cardio, but what about, as it applies to strength training or resistance training, if you're lifting weights, like, is there a same way to apply this sort of scale?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are actually a number of studies relating to how RPE deals with resistance training, and it's pretty much common sense. So basically, I'll give you some examples of some of the studies. So one study measured people doing reps or doing exercises where they were at 90% of their 1 rep max, where they did 5 reps at 90%. They did, I believe it was 9 reps or 10 reps at 70% of their 1 rep max, and they were doing 15 reps at 50% of their 1 rep max, right? So anytime, your 1 rep max basically is whatever weight you can lift for exactly 1 repetition, no more, no less. And so a lot of times when you design a training program, you're going to design it based on percentages of the 1 rep max.
Oh, wow.
For a lot of
that's great information.
So for a lot of exercises, you can find a close correlation between like let's say 75% of your 1 rep max, you should be able to do about 12 repetitions at 70%, but it varies by the exercise, and you don't always have to design programs like this, but for the most part, it's an easy way to design, figure out, okay, if you can do, if your 1 rep max is 100 pounds on this, then 75 will get you X amount of reps and 70 will get you this amount of reps. So basically the program, the study was designed this way. And as expected, which group do you think perceived the exercise as the hardest?
Groups between
90%, 70%, and 50%.
Well, the 90.
Okay, yeah. So now, interestingly, if you think about it, they were doing the volume appropriate for the weight, right? So the 90%, they did 5 reps, and that was it, right? 70% could do whatever it was, 9 or 10 reps. That's the max that they could do for 10 reps. So in a lot of ways, they did the same work, right? For proportional to like what they can.
Then in that case, I might change my answer.
What?
So it was 90. That it could even be the 70% would have the most perceived, because they did actually more reps. So
then the 50% did 15 reps.
Yeah, but I would feel that the hardest working, it was weight to rep ratio would be in the 70%.
Well, you were right the first time. It was 90%.
It was 90%.
Yeah, yeah. Because basically, the idea, I mean, it makes sense. Heavy loads require more muscle activity, more muscle fiber recruitment. Takes more neuromuscular control. So doing that heavy lift just takes more work. So you're going to perceive it as harder. It happens over it's more work over a shorter period of time. If you look at all three, let's say we did the same equal work for each, for the sake of argument, you're doing it over a shorter period because you're with the 90, and you're recruiting more in one, in fewer moves. In 5 reps, you're recruiting as much effort as you are for 12 reps or for 15. Let's, just for the sake of argument. So that's that's. So it goes to show, and I'll give you a couple other studies. So there's another study that took people lifting their 1 rep max. So they were doing the 1 rep max in a bench press, a deadlift, and a squat. And when asked what their rate of perceived exertion was when doing their 1 rep max, the results all ranged in the 9.5 range. So again, 1 rep max was very close to what your max would be on an RPE scale, which would be 10, right? So 10 is your max on an RPE scale. And when they were doing their 1 rep max, they were close to that. Then one other study found that slower velocities led to higher RPE. So if you think about it, if I'm doing a bench press and I'm struggling, the harder the weight is, the slower it's going to take for me to push the weight up, right? Right. If I'm doing any weight, the heavier the weight, the more time it's going to take. Okay, right? It just makes sense, right? If I have 200 pounds, it's going to be slower for me at max effort to push that up than if I do 100 pounds. Okay. Right. So, and also slower velocities were inversely proportional to RPE. So,
although I feel with certain weightlifting, if you have a technique, it's the same. No. Right. I guess unless you're doing insanely heavy weight. I don't think so. Because if you're doing a squat and you're doing if your tempo is your tempo.
But
right. If it takes you 2 seconds to 1 second to explode up, it's 1 second no matter how much weight, unless it's so much weight that you have to push.
There's still a load, so that gravity is still fighting you a little bit. So so the slower velocity, it's even if it's slight, even if it's a fraction of a second. But anyway, the slower velocities were correlated with higher RPEs. Right. So basically, the idea is strength training. You can use a similar RPE scale for strength training. It just becomes slightly different with how you would, how you do it. So when we're dealing with RPEs for cardio, typically you're kind of thinking about where am I right now, but it's still in the overall context of the workout. So if I'm running let's say I'm doing if I want to do a hard 15-minute run, then I'm probably going to be closer to the 8 or 9 range in number. But I want to be in that 8 or 9 number for the whole time. Unless, we're not including interval training now or other styles of training. We're just saying traditional, you're doing a certain amount for a certain period of time. So for the cardio, I'm going to try to stay in that range for the whole time. And if I go up, I got to bring it back down. If I drop down, I got to pull it back up. That's going to be kind of what you're going to do for cardio. For strength training, it's a little bit different because it's within each set. So if you're doing strength training and you want to kind of keep an RPEs in mind, basically a 10 would be your max. We typically don't want to go to 10 because that's to complete neuromuscular fatigue, and it's not. There are a number of reasons why, unless you have a very specific reason to do it, you probably don't want to be going to 10. Basically, 9.5 would be you're done. Like you couldn't perform another rep. Like that was it. So you've done as many reps as you can, but you might be able to increase the weight a little bit, right? Because 10 is your max. Okay. A 9 would be you can get another rep in. It'd be hard. You'd struggle, but you could probably get another rep in. Now 8.5 would be again like 1 to 2 reps left to go. Like you could probably squeeze out 1 to 2 reps. With most strength training, I would say 8 to 9 is the range you're going to want to be in. For the most part, that's the range where you're getting enough tension to help you build, but you're also not pushing yourself to the point where you're going to get injured or you're going to neuromuscular fatigue, which can stimulate certain responses that may not be good for you unless, again, you have a very specific need for it. Like really 10 is competition level. Like 10, 9.5 is pretty much like you're competing, and that's what you're going to do when you're competing. You're going all out. So then you have like 7.5 and 7 would be kind of 2 to 3 reps, like in that range. Like you could do 2 to 3 more, which for the most part, unless maybe if you're doing lighter weights, or you're doing more muscle endurance, or you're warming up, you could be in that range. But generally, for the most part, you want to be in a range where you could probably perform 1 or 2 more reps, but they would be very challenging. Like that's the range for most strength training protocols to stick with. Again, it varies a little bit, but that's generally where you're going to look at. So you can use RPEs or rate of perceived exertion for your strength training routines. It's just that you have to think about it within each set rather than thinking about it over the course of the workout. Now, the other thing to consider is how many reps you're doing. So again, and we've talked about this before, so I won't go too much into detail, and it's stuff you could look up. And I'll try to leave in the notes what episode we talk about it. But if you're looking to get stronger, your rep range is going to be different from if you're looking to build muscle endurance, or if you're looking to build size, it's going to be slightly different from if you're training, for sporting competition. And then even sporting competitions, you have different rep ranges depending on whatever the requirements are for the sport. So there's other variables. Right now we're just talking about, how to perceive what you're doing and the work.
All right. Well, I guess the classic GymWitsian question would be, how does someone use this in a sort of practical way without sort of getting too crazy? You're not going to have a blood lactate count, I don't even know how you would measure that.
You
don't have that. It's sort of it's all perception, as you said.
Yeah.
So you sort of have this idea. Like when you're working out, you say, okay, I'm going to do an 8. I'm going to make sure an 8. Like, how do you really go about doing that? Or isn't it just like working out? It's like, I feel like I'm really tired. I can barely get a rep. So that's like how do you really use
that's a good
this?
question. So there are a few different ways. So I would say when it comes to cardio, okay, so I kind of explained with the reps, with the weights, like where you should be.
Again, that almost makes a little more sense.
So the weights make more sense.
All right, I know that I want to go to where I'm not at exhaustion, but I'm almost at exhaustion.
So there are a few different things with the cardio to consider. So let's say, like I mentioned earlier, let's say a 0, is you're sitting on the couch watching TV, like absolute minimum activity. That's a 0. Where a 0.51 would be maybe you're shifting around in sitting down but kind of shifting like you're doing right now, rocking back and forth in your chair, like you're some minor movement but nothing intense. A 2 might be a very slow walk. You're shopping, you're in the grocery store kind of browsing really slowly down the aisles, where a 3 would be a walk. You're moving, so you're maybe a brisk walk. And then it starts to increase. So, a 4, 5 might be a light jog, so that you're increasing your activity, a light jog, or a something where you can feel like you're working a little bit.
Okay.
And then then 6 is you're working up a sweat. So whatever the activity is, you're working up a sweat. You can still hold a conversation, but you're starting to work up a sweat.
That's exactly what that poster said. It's exactly what.
Then
they even said the whole I can have a conversation.
7, then that's where the intensity really starts to ramp up a little bit. So 7, you really start. You can start feeling a little bit late, not hard breathing, not heavy, but you can start feeling your breathing, and that the work. And then 8 becomes a challenge. Like 8's hard. And then 9 and 10, you're getting close to your max. So 9 you can maybe keep up for a couple minutes, and 10 is like all out sprint as hard as you can go. You're near your max. And so there are other, now that was me just thinking I didn't write down cues. That's probably something I should have done. But there are other cues, and again, I'll link to some stuff where you kind of give you some ideas on like, 1 would be compared to this and a 2 would be compared to that, so that you can kind of use that to measure. But that's how so basically you would go into your cardio workout saying, I'm going to run for X amount of time and I want to stay in, this range. So again, the time is proportional to the to the intensity. So the longer you are, the lower the intensity or perceived exertion is going to be. The lower your fitness level, the lower the perceived exertion is going to be. The shorter the time, in order to get results, the higher the intensity has to be. So again, if you're doing a 20-minute workout, you're probably going to have to be closer to that if you can manage it, the 7-8 range. And if it's a shorter workout, you're probably gonna be closer to the 6-7 range. So it really depends. But again, it depends on the person. I know athletes who can maintain 8 for an hour, or 9 for an hour. It really, but maybe it's not really then for them. It's relative. So
for them, it's not really
8 or 9. Yeah.
So interesting thought. When this starts to relate to time, what's really stopping someone from saying, well, I'm just going to work out 15 minutes, 20 minutes, close to an 8 or a 9, and that's my whole workout, right? Is that and we know that doesn't really get you as good as a workout. It does, but
when did we say?
All right,
that?
so we remember maybe a little bit less time. We know that there's sort of a balance. Remember, we actually talked about it with the 1 minute workouts, where you're going really all out for 1 minute.
Yeah.
And we say that while yes, it gets you the same benefits, there are a lot of benefits that it doesn't get you. Like for instance, if you want to gain a certain amount of mass, a certain amount of strength, it's just impossible with only doing 15 minutes to really get those results. So while you're working out, while you get fitness benefits, you might not receive certain results. I don't know about with running, but even if you manage to run for 15 minutes at whatever would be get you to an 8 or something like that, is it the same benefits as working out for longer and maybe doing 8, but with some rest in between? Like it's not accounting for any of those. Any of those other things, Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's a risk reward. So a couple things. It depends on the goal, number one. If it's just fitness, I just want to strengthen my heart.
Okay.
Then there's the jury's still out, but there's a lot out there that's to say that the 15-minute run is going to be as effective, if not more effective, than the longer
than a 6
time.
Okay, so just a run, yes.
But it depends on what your goal is. If the goal is if you need to build muscle, then you got to spend more time. If your goal if your goal is to run a marathon, then you've got to spend more time. Or so really a lot depends on the goal. But as far as just like meeting your daily activity requirement and intensity level, sure, if you could do it in 10-15 minutes, it just is that the level of work puts you at higher risk for injury.
Sure.
Just does. And it's hard. So it's something that mentally may be difficult for people to handle. So,
but you can't. But with weights, you just can't do it.
No, but that's it. So you can't
you can do it with a run or
that's
some
why
sort
I said
of cardio.
If it's a cardiovascular benefits, fine. But it's not with weights. No, you can't do it with weights.
And do we even really know if? You could.
No, you know what?
Like if you did a circuit of sort with weights and just lots of heavy stuff, but it's impossible because your muscle fatigue.
Well, you don't know that. We don't know that for sure. Like we're so limited. As far as what we know, I've read things that go both ways. I've read some things that say like one set at maximum can have benefits, and then I've read things that
have benefits.
But no, equal benefits too. So again, just saying that the jury's out. Like you can't say definitively one way or another, and also it's very specific to the person. So some people can benefit from one set, and other people need months and months and years of just consistent, constant work for there to be any progress. So it really depends on the person.
Because we know that people are often looking for the way to do the least work. So my whole thing is, could people use this as as a sort of excuse, to kind of similar to our 1 minute workout, to say, well, all I got to do is really work out for 10 minutes and I'm just going to try to really bust it for 10 minutes.
I mean, if they
and
can
that's
do
good
that,
enough.
But if they can do that and their goal, again, it depends on the goal. If you just want to meet your requirements for exercise and you're willing to suck up the intensity of it, which not many people are. There are not many people that are willing to put in the amount of effort you need to put into that 10 minutes to make that 10 minutes valuable. But if you're willing to do it and you're fit enough to handle it, then there's nothing wrong with that.
This is interesting because you have to be very fit in the first place. Because remember, it's relative.
Yeah.
So
it's just that there are higher risks for the higher intensity.
It's true. And if you're not at a certain fitness level, if you try to really go all out, there's a good chance of injury or something might happen.
Potentially. So it really. Look, I don't recommend, high intensity interval training for somebody who's unfit, or I don't recommend it at a high level, but it's become so person specific that if you can maintain and manage that high intensity for 10-15 minutes, as long as you don't have a specific goal that requires you to be in the gym longer, then by all means, and there was just something I almost used for the study of the week that was actually talking about the benefits of high intensity interval training and we'll probably do this in the next few episodes, outweigh for obese patients, basically the benefits of the high intensity work will outweigh the risks, which there are risks of
that sounds very statistic based.
Yeah, absolutely.
That in the overall it might, but
yeah, it does.
It's very easy.
So, I mean, it's easy
to say that on a statistical nature, but when it's your loved one who just had a heart attack because they were being being pushed too hard, right? So, statistically speaking, or either had a heart attack or a stroke or felt because they were not fit, they fell and had a bad leg injury or something like that.
Well, that's exactly the point, though. So it's like, yes, some people are not, but it's like you will positively affect a greater number of people if you took everybody that's obese and you had them involved in a high intensity program.
Now we're going into Rousseau's.
You will have a greater number of people that will benefit from it than the number that will suffer from the negative effects.
Good. Yeah,
so
that's such a statistical way of looking at things.
It
might
is,
not
but
be realistic. It's theoretically works,
but the whole point is just in theory, at least according to this study, I don't have it at the notes, but according to this study. Again, the benefits outweigh the risks. That's all. So obviously it's stats, obviously it's numbers, but it's not an easy thing to say. But it's also not an easy thing to say. Go continue with your life as it is, and you'll have a heart attack in a few months or a few weeks. So I would take look if it's choosing between engaging in some form of exercise program that's somewhat risky or keeping a life that will eventually lead to heart disease, I'm going to do the exercise and just take the risks. That's it. That's life. But you want to be careful with that type of reasoning because it could lead you down bad roads, when it comes to if you're going to say, it's kind of like where you get some of the science denial and it's like the anti-vaccine people, it's like, oh, well, in a small percentage, it's like with vaccines, right? A small percentage of people are going to, or anything, any medication, a small percentage might be negatively affected, but it's for the overall greater good, it saves far more lives. So you can't look at those individual instances. You have to look at it as a whole, and is it benefiting society and people as a whole?
Well, this is
my argument for
our philosophers. Like when you start, like Rousseau and John Locke would, they're always talking about the the greater good of the people. Yeah. Right. It's just I just find it so so easy to say that theoretically, right? But if something causes your loved one to get hurt or sick or injured, right? Then it's just. But
that's arguing again. That's a fallacious reasoning because that's arguing from personal. You're arguing from personal experience.
I'm not saying I exactly. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. That's how it
doesn't make it any better.
It's very easy to say, oh, this is the best thing, but it's very hard to go out and do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It's like the person that's saying, like we should invade because it's best for our country. Well, why don't you go and fight the war?
You're right.
Why don't you pick up a gun and go?
That's
start
where
you
have to take kind of
your life.
Your personal out of your philosophy.
Yes,
you kind of have to take yourself out of your philosophy.
Yes, if you can do that and you can look at it from purely statistics, then yes, of course, but not always. Not always realistic to do that.
It's kind of like even again we get not to get too political, but if you have a a situation that you realize benefits more people, but you don't benefit as much, then it's like, well, what's for the greater good? It's just the way I like to look at
the greater
world
good of
that
the people
way,
or the greater good of me.
Me, yeah, and that's part of that's part of I see that every day. I see that kind of conflict
but almost generally what's for the greater good of one person is almost never for the greater good of all. Like if you think about it, wealth is by someone taking all the wealth from themselves is not for the greater good of all. Someone spreading the wealth would be for the greater good of all, but it's not for the greater good of that person.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it depends, because then you have arguments of whether or not, like, if someone has it, where they distribute it, and can they innovate based on it, and will it trickle down, but again, that gets into a whole other
goes into a whole other thing
that we are not a podcast about that stuff.
Well, we are philosophers, and this is fitness philosophy of sorts. So it's an interesting concept, and we'll have to talk about it in future podcasts. The idea of fitness statistics, and just the sort of idea of the greater good. So I like that idea. is definitely something that we should that we will touch upon.
All right, you figure out how we make that work, and we'll do it.
Yeah.
So anyway, I hope I explained that well enough. I went off a couple tangents.
Well, I think it's interesting. I still think it's common sense, right? You feel how your body goes. Granted, I've been working out for a while, so I know my body. But it's, to me, it makes sense.
Here's one example why you don't always want to fall into that. So often, what's difficult for somebody today. So let's say, for example, and I deal with this all the time with people. So you start your routine. You go running on the treadmill for 40 minutes, and you put the treadmill at 6, and that's your run. You do that this week, and you do it, and it's hard this week. You do it next week, and it gets a little bit easier, and you just keep doing it. But you for the most part, you stay there. So that's just your workout. And this is what happens. This is the rut that people fall into, is that they essentially kind of stick with the same workout, and they don't increase. We've talked about increasing variables.
We know that we have to progress.
Okay, but for some people, they don't. They just kind of fall into that. And it just maybe just happens over time. They're not even considering it. It's like, all right, I'm running, I work up a little sweat. That's it, and do it. Great, I'm getting better at it. And then they keep doing it. So, yeah, we know you're supposed to increase variables and you're supposed to progress and make things harder, but not everyone knows that. Not everyone's listened to every episode of the podcast. So if you don't, then you start to you can say the same thing. If you're doing your run and you should be around a 6 or 7 and you're finding yourself at a 4 or 5, then you need to increase. Yeah. So it's that kind of that's the time when it can help, is that if you're doing the same thing, if you're doing the same weights, if you're doing a curl or press or whatever, and you're getting to the point where you're doing the same weight you did 6 months ago, but you're doing far more reps, or with the reps, we were thinking like how much is left in the tank. So if I want to stay around an 8, I want to have 1, maybe 2 left in the tank. If I'm doing my reps and I have 6 left in the tank, then I got to increase the weight, because that's not really as effective as it should be. I want to have about 1 or 2 left in the tank, not 8 or not 6 or not 5. So it's a way to think about your workouts, that you can think, where am I and where should I be, and do I need to make changes? And that's it. So I think that there is a practical application. I don't do it as much, because for me, kind of my workouts tend to be all or nothing. It's like either I'm working as hard as I can, or I'm just kind of half-assing. But kind of that lends itself more towards like combat sports a little bit. So I try to train in a way that mimics that to some extent. So. But just for general average normal workouts, like it gives you something to work with. So we have an Ask the Trainer, right?
Okay, and it comes from Nathaniel. It goes, hey Ryan and Chef, I started running about 6 months ago, and I really got into it. I run about 5 days a week and was really starting to see results. About 2 months into my running, I started feeling persistent pain in my knee that required 3 months of physio to correct it. I guess, does he mean physical therapy?
Probably. Yeah, I tend to find that I know people that I know from England refer to physical therapy as physio. Or physical therapists as physio.
Oh, so yeah, there he says.
So maybe that's it.
The therapist believes that the knee problems were due to running too fast, and that I should start to slow down. Do you have any suggestions on how I can start a running program again without injuring myself?
One thing I think the running it's too much.
Doing
fast.
It was running not running too fast, but doing too much running without having built up to it. Sorry, I misread
all
that.
This running talk today. All right, so I'm not. I would ask the physical therapist what you should be doing or what you can't do. So find out what you can or can't do. If I'm correct, and it's about doing too much, let's say too much mileage, or you're doing too many days a week, which my assumption is that you're doing too many days a week, and it's kind of a cumulative thing. Again, it's a little challenging because I don't know the injury and I haven't talked to the physical therapist, but my suggestion would be pretty common sense, is just start slower. So let's say if you were running, I would half whatever you were doing. So if you were running, let's say 5 days a week, then do 2 or 3. If you were running 4 days a week, do 2. If you're running 6 days a week, do that. And then I would kind of cut the actual runs by about 75%. So I would just say you want to kind of decrease your mileage and build up. Often when people start fitness programs, they tend to do a lot. right off the bat, because you're excited, it's fun, you're seeing results, and that's where the injuries come into play. So my only suggestion might be, it doesn't sound like the injury was too serious, but again, I don't know what you didn't mention what the injury is, so I would just kind
pain
of
in the knee.
Yeah, but pain in the
something very interesting about this. Too much too fast, but a knee doesn't strengthen. A knee is a joint. You can't strengthen your knees, really. You can sort of strengthen your joints a little bit. So I don't see how doing too much too fast, like I can understand your legs, your heart, if it's just affecting your overall body, going to exhaustion, like exhausting yourself. But I don't see how doing that would affect your knee.
Absolutely. There are tons of ways for that to happen. One
you're just
very simple example. Let me give you.
But never building up to it wouldn't make a difference, no matter what it would. Wrong. How would building up to it strengthen your knee?
Very simple. So let's say,
unless you're correcting other aspects of your body.
Okay, there are so many ways that. There's so many. I'll give you two examples. Example one, very simple, which also would require a trainer or some kind of a professional, just running with bad form. So if you're running with bad form and you're doing it a lot, you could have knee problems. Second problem, compensation injuries. So let's say that you do too much running, you're going to have some kind of let's say any number of muscles are going to fatigue. So instead of stopping the run when you're fatigued, you keep doing it, but now you have to compensate for that fatigued muscle. Mm-hmm. So then you start to change your form or change how you're moving or do some little variable changes that puts the knee in a bad position. It could be overuse. Again, overuse injuries happen easily. A cumulative injury. You haven't built up the it could be a cartilage injury. It could be.
But that you can't really strengthen.
You can't strengthen it, but you can
strengthen the muscles around.
Yeah,
it.
and you can again. It's building up to being able to deal with whatever the stress is. Like that's part of exercise is progressing, and if you do too much too soon, you don't allow yourself to recover. So, and then if you push yourself past a certain point, depending on what the movement is, depending on the joints and the muscles involved, you can injure something. You could tear something or strain something really easily just with an overuse injury. So it's very much possible that too much too soon could cause a joint injury.
Well, so with that being said, are there any non-running exercises? I know that we talked about if you want to get better at running, you have to run. But are there any either doing weights or other types of exercises in some of the resistance, maybe stretching, that can actually help with running or help the body?
Sure. I mean, sure, there are tons of kind of cross-training and complementary exercises and stretching. Again, I don't know how they would help Nathaniel, because I would have to see, I'd have to do kind of a movement assessment on him and to see where if and what kind of compensation patterns there are.
An issue with he might have a weakness
could be any
in
number
one body,
of injuries.
Which is affecting
so
his
my suggestion to Nathaniel would be, like I said, I would start when you start back up. I would cut everything in half. But cut your days in half, then cut the amount of time at least by 70-75%, and then build up from there. Well, I would definitely, before doing any of this, I would talk to the physical therapist, talk to your doctor, and find out like what's kind of contraindicated, what can't you do. So it might be that you can't run, but it doesn't sound like it. But find out what you can't do. If they have suggestions on mileage, get some suggestions from them. Make sure they do have some work with athletes, but get ideas about what parameters you have and what you can and can't do with the running, and then also.
I like that idea of learning to making sure
you
that
need to make sure
you're
doing the running properly, because a lot of people don't, and it's a very common thing. I see people running all the time, and there's just little things that you do wrong, and it can easily lead to an injury, even if you're not running too many miles or doing too much.
There's also one more thing that I'm wondering about, Nathaniel. What are you running on? If you're running on concrete, that can have a devastating effect on your knee, as opposed to either running on a
that
grass
can be
or
overblown. That's personally.
I've heard that running on concrete can really affect your
But that's
knees.
more of a product of not running properly.
So then you really have to make sure you're using
the
right form.
I think it's like the impact can have an effect if your form is not good. But if you have good form, there's not much difference between running on concrete or running on a flat surface, or running on like grass or running on a treadmill. There's going to be minimal differences, but you're essentially the whole point of running is you're trying to propel yourself forward. And if there's heavy impact on the ground, that means that the forces that as much as possible, your forces should be driving you forward. And if you're making a lot of impact with the ground, that means a lot of your force is going into the ground, which means that there's some kind of improper or inefficient kind of use and or transfer of energy, and there's a problem with the movement. So even on concrete, there shouldn't be so much impact on the ground. So I would say, again, any surface is going to be fine as long as it's, like if you're on a really unstable surface, that could just lead to an injury as far as like turning an ankle or something. But as long as you're running, the form is good. The surface doesn't make as big of a difference as you would think. Because you hear it, it's like, well, yeah, concrete made sense because it's really hard and you don't want the impact. But it really doesn't make much difference if your form is correct.
Right. So, Nathaniel, I think, definitely check out your form. Speak to your doctors and your physical therapist. And I guess also maybe do some stuff to supplement it. There's some exercises. If you're finding that parts of your body are weak or not as strong as others, like how would you find out if you're compensating? And then how would you know how to approach that?
You'd need somebody to perform
sort
of movement analysis.
So that might be a really good suggestion. Have a professional perform a movement analysis and see if you are doing things that are really hurting you in this instance, and then maybe you can take some steps to approach it. So, Nathaniel, I hope that answers your question. Please write us in. Let us know what you wind up doing. And
if you're in New York, I know a good guy. I have a friend that's a physical therapist, a runner, and very good with form and technique when it comes to running. If you're in New York, let me know. I got a guy for you.
Or you can do my recommendation when it comes to running, and that's just not to run.
Do it. Yeah.
I hate running.
Yeah. Not my favorite thing in the world. All right. Well, as usual, all of our stuff is at thegymwits.com. Definitely follow us, like us on Facebook. Follow us if you can.
Follow us, like us,
subscribe.
Follow us. Subscribe.
Yeah, listen to us wherever you do. Spotify,
spread
iTunes,
the word. Tell people about us.
Exactly.
That actually really helps us too.
Yes, and rate us, please. Rate us. We need the ratings.
And if you feel you can definitely weite us some checks too if you want to just send us a whole bunch of money.
No, don't send us any money. Send it to you can send money to the ACLU in our name if you want. or Planned Parenthood or whatever. I think I gave away our political affiliations. Anyway, not to get too political, I think, which I said now 3 times today. That's it.
You could just send it to the whatever anti-Trump organization of your choice. No, I'm just kidding.
No. I'm just kidding. Let's not go that far. No, we try to stay out of it.
Yeah, we stay.
All right. I'm Ryan George.
All right, I'm Justin Guild, a.k.a. Chef Sonic.
And we are the GymWits.